Recently, Diablo 4's fifth and final character, the Necromancer, was officially announced. But what are the major changes to the class players should be aware of before they even consider the character? And more importantly, will the Necromancer's spells, weapons, and items be better or worse for old and new players alike? Well, without further ado, here is every tiny detail and crucial change from the Necromancer's gameplay footage that we've seen so far.
You will be a priest of Rathma, a necromancer. And you will not confront the darkness alone. We are the speakers of the dead, and the dead have no mercy.
First, let's take a brief look again at the core class features surrounding the Necromancer. Returning to the forefront of gameplay focus is Essence, familiar thanks to Diablo 3, the essential resource the class utilizes for its various spells and abilities. While Diablo 4 promises to harken back to Diablo 2, managing mana will not return. Instead, without doing anything, the Necro's essence accumulates very slowly normally, but utilizing basic abilities will build essence faster to be used for bigger spells, which may or may not consume the next resource, being corpses. Of course, a spellcaster who deals in the magic of life and death would utilize and leverage the fallen remains of their victims in various forms. From major horde-clearing explosions to raising skeletal minions, which is of course a welcome return to form from Diablo 2, and Mist in Diablo 3 and Immortal, among various other things. Corpses will not only be created from slaughtering enemies, but also from other sources, which likely revolve around pets, such as when a skeletal mage or minion is dismissed or killed, leaving behind the corpse that was utilized to create them. Corpses have always made up a huge part of the Necromancer's arsenal focus, and that remains true even into Diablo 4. As many options are being made available for players that really want to lean in and focus in on this particular gruesome aspect of the class. Additionally, curses are once again taking a major focus in the Necromancer's gameplay, which were utilized quite heavily in Diablo 2, but only for a select number of builds in Diablo 3, and virtually non-existent in Immortal. But doesn't even look like a Necromancer. Thankfully, the Necromancer, aesthetically at least, appears in very true form to their prior incarnations, whether you feel the game looks quite similar to D3 still or not. But unlike previous installments of the series, the one facet of their class that is so synonymous with the stereotypes that surround them, raising the dead, becomes fully interlinked with builds in their core class feat. But what does that mean? Well, as discussed in our video on the Necromancer's reveal, we've learnt the Book of the Dead is revealed to us as the central mechanic of this specific class.
The Book of the Dead? Are you sure you want to be playing around with this thing?
It's just a book. No harm ever came from reading a book.
From it, the Necromancer selects and specifies the various roles and powers of his summons, or chooses to forego them entirely in exchange for permanent buffs that allow them to favor other powers while still wielding the undead as a shroud of might, which we will break down. Now honestly, the naming missed an opportunity to call back to say a Necronomicon, but I'd hate to see players having to put in a password every time they open the menu for this feature, but I digress. Each minion type, skeletal minion, mage, and golem is broken down into 3 types, each selectable, upgradable, or sacrificial for the obtaining of mighty boons. And it's quite interesting to see the functionality change for minion types, as although the minions mostly seem familiar from Diablo 2 and 3, the new functionality adds a layer of complexity which we're about to break down. Starting with Raised Skeleton, you can select between skeletal skirmishers, defenders, and reapers. Skirmishers bring increased melee damage and moderate health. Defenders, increased health and defense with reduced damage, and reapers that deal in a short arc arc directly in front of them. We take a moment to look upon the nature of the upgrade and sacrifice potential for the defenders. One upgrade allows the defenders to negate one instance of direct damage they would receive once every 10 seconds, while the other increases thorns received from the necromancer between 30 and 50%. If instead the necromancer chooses to sacrifice their defender, thus losing the ability to summon a skeletal minion from this category, meaning skirmishers, defenders, and reapers, they gain permanent 15% non-physical damage resistance until otherwise toggled. Skeletal mages return as a more permanent minion rather than a temporary summon, and once again deal magic damage of different types. But instead of Diablo 2's elemental assortment, the mages deal damage similar to that of their summoner's aesthetic, meaning shadow, cold, and bone, which become the focus of power for the necromancer's mages in Diablo 4. Cold mages who chill and freeze targets can toggle between funneling essence to their master by 2 points per hit from their primary attack, or making targets vulnerable if they damage a frozen enemy with the same. And should the necromancer sacrifice them, they will gain a multiple of 15% in damage to vulnerable foes. Bone mages literally use their own bones to damage enemies, dealing high damage at the cost of their own life. Should the necromancer choose, however, they can reduce the amount of damage they sustain, and after a short period of living, gain an immense boost in power. Or they can leave behind their corpse after death, fortifying the necromancer. And in the event the necromancer chooses to sacrifice the mage, they gain 30% increased overpower damage. Lastly, we arrive at golems, who, unlike their skeletal counterparts, have an activatable effect associated with their skill button. When toggled, a golem will use their own special ability along with being a passive tank minion that also comes with 2 different upgrades, individually active and a sacrificial function. First up, bone golems, who act as true tanks taunting enemies in a large area, can be upgraded to shed corpses after taking so much damage, or receive 10% increased life and an increase in thorns from its master. Sacrificing it increases the caster's attack speed by 10%. Next, the blood golems return, siphoning health from nearby enemies. They can also be upgraded to absorb 15% of the damage you would normally receive, or receive 25% less damage while increasing their damage by a multiple of 25. If sacrificed, they increase the necromancer's maximum life by 10%, a fitting end with blood for blood. Finally, the iron golem, the metal-headed brute that slams and stuns the ground around them, while being upgradable to deal spike damage of 16% at every 5th attack to their primary targets and those standing behind them, or make enemies vulnerable after their slam attacks. If you instead choose to sacrifice them, you deal a massive 30% increased critical strike damage, which we know is perfect for those bone necros, and never fear, there'll be a build video coming soon. It should go to note that only one sacrifice upgrade looks to be activatable per minion category in the Book of the Dead, so I guess try and choose well for your builds. However, that's all we currently know about the class's speciality from the available gameplay footage and screenshots. Hopefully, we'll be able to see more from a beta, perhaps in the future. Many facets of the Necromancer's aesthetic return in Diablo 4 that are callbacks to their playstyle in Diablo 2. So as we move through these frozen Khazra-infested caves, let's look at some of these returning aspects. With or without minions, the Necromancer brandishes their magic in such a way that both makes them feel less extreme and over the top, and grounds them to their more believable motifs seen first in Diablo 2. Their bone spears return to the spectral talons of Trag'Oul, which we first saw in Diablo 2, versus the masses of bone shrapnels spewed forth from Diablo 3. And it seems they can be spec'd to return to smaller shrapnel projectiles if they pierce their target to make contact with solid surfaces behind them. We also see, as always, corpses litter the ground in the Necromancer's wake as hordes of Khazra are torn asunder by bolts of blight and wide-swept arcs from Reap, and do not go without use. whether as a weapon by use of corpse explosion, which again returns. Also is the return of summoning material from corpses used for pets, last seen in Diablo 2, which returns to center stage for the Necromancer as a general resource. It's kind of like what the Necromongers said in Riddick, you keep what you kill. However, it should also be noted that they're not fully utilized in every build, and sometimes corpses are difficult to come by, particularly in instances involving, you guessed it, PvP. As we move over to the Fields of Hatred, which is Diablo 4's answer to PvP, the lore hook states that Mephisto's hatred bubbles up into different areas of the world, which somehow makes player-on-player combat functional and an integrated part of the story without having factions, and we're just going to see basically a bloody free-for-all between the 5 classes, which we will cover in an upcoming video, but for now we're focusing on the Necromancer. Aside from watching the Necromancer get absolutely wrecked, we see one big flaw in having a PvP build that's heavily reliant on corpses being the lack of corpse production in PvP, which doesn't make for a healthy longevity for pet builds in big fights like this. However, builds that are more solo-oriented appear to be doing better as the Necromancer lays down large areas of curses. Specifically, the Iron Maiden, which in Diablo 2 returned damage to the attacker, just like the Thorn's Aura of the Paladin, and decimates with bolts of blight and raining shards of bone, slaughtering their enemies with wanton disregard for life in general. Life is overrated. I mean, who cares? We can just raise them again later. Now, this is the final class breakdown until we get more gameplay footage out of the rogue or other classes, but please make sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date with Diablo 4's characters and lore. And as always, thanks for watching, and until next time, Traveler.